Hi guys. So my name's Emma and I got a grade 9 in my GCSE English Literature. I did Jane Eyre, Romeo and Juliet and Spectacles. And I'm just going to be making some YouTube videos, sharing my notes, sharing the quotes I used. Because I just want to, help people out. Thought it'd be quite useful. Today I'm going to be doing a video on the reeds and the red room, so enjoy. Let's just see if I can work this PowerPoint. Okay, my first quote is about Mrs. Reed. And it says, "She lay reclined on a sofa by the fireside with her darlings about her." And this shows a striking tableau, which is basically fancy word for an image. It shows the image of Mrs. Reed's power over her daughters. She's on the sofa with her daughters at her feet, and it shows she's at a higher level over her daughters. And from a certain perspective, it also emphasizes how Miss Reed, is dominating over Jane herself, and sort of emphasizes Jane's own oppression in the Reed family. Jane is also isolated from the fire. She's in the cold. She's denied access from the love of the Reeds. And this emphasizes Jane's exile within the family. This theme of exile recurs throughout the book, which you'll see. The Reeds are also unified by privilege. They're all, huddled around by the fire. Furthermore, emphasizes Jane's own oppression, I suppose. And this whole scene initiates one of the central themes in Jane Eyre, which is a central binary opposition of fire and ice. If you can call that a theme, I guess. It's sort of an image. Usually Jane is seen as the fire because, she's all fiery and angry emotionally, but in this scene it's sort of inverted as Jane's in the cold, her and the ice represents the pain of exclusion, of neglect, while, the fire represents the love that Jane wants, the emotions that she's sort of isolated from. Let's have a look at John Reed now. One of his quotes: "You have no business to take our books. They are mine." This quote exudes absolute patriarchal entitlement. You can see the possessive pronoun "our" shows how John reigns over his books. This exudes absolute power play. He really likes those books. He also exploits Jane's double bind of class and gender. So this idea of a double bind of class and gender was quite popular. During the Victorian literature of Charlotte Bronte. Basically, it was the idea that Jane is sort of less privileged because she's female, because she's lower class. And Bronte really emphasizes this idea of a double bind of class and gender because it just shows how limited Jane is because of something she cannot control. And yes, this theme also recurs throughout the whole book of Jane Eyre. It sort of also puts in perspective Bronte's more feminist worldview. This quote also shows John's contemptful cutting use of the second person pronoun you. It does sound quite contemptful. He demands subservience, and you can see from this quote, from this scene, how Jane's struggle against male oppression begins within the book. One could argue that the fact that Bronte shows Jane's oppression from such a young age sort of shows Bronte's own disdain of how young girls, how the underprivileged have to survive, have to fight against those who are just born into power. And she sort of argues that this isn't right, this shouldn't be happening. From a certain perspective, John is also seen as less intelligent, less mature. He's incapable of controlling his emotions and having a sensitive understanding of Jane's own predisposition and her pain. Literally throws a book at Jane, not very, quite childish, I would argue. And this elevates Jane in a way, as Jane is seen as a more mature being. To some extent, I mean, she does sort of punch John, but she didn't initiate the fight. She was just hiding at the start, really. And this draws the audience into Jane, draws the reader into Jane, makes her a prominent character. Another quote: habitually obedient to, accustomed to. This is talking about John Reed, of course. John's is a symbol of a master, elevated by his cruel treatment of Jane. Shows his patriarchal, oppressive ideology. The use of the adverb habitually emphasizes the relentlessness of the abuse that Jane has to endure from John Reed. You can see the status quo of toxic masculinity formed from the outset. And yes, you can use that in your English literature essay. John also obviously enjoys this obviously also shows John's sadistic enjoyment of violence. Habitually shows how this violence occurs time and time again as well, which is slightly disturbing for a 21st century audience. And furthermore, Jane's abuse highlights even more and more the pain that she has to endure because she's an orphan, because she suffers from an ambiguous social standing, which contrasts deeply to John's privilege, John's masculinity that Jane is deprived of. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Red Room, which is quite an impressive turning point in Jane's own progression. Not sure what it's called on the Freytag's pyramid, the point of incidence. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's something about that. Okay, if you've never heard of Gilbert and Gubar, they're two literary critics that wrote a bunch of stuff about Jane Eyre. I'd recommend you research them. They're quite useful, but they also have some pretty cool quotes that you can use in your essays. For example, these. I'll let you have a read of them. Pause the video if you want to read them some more. Okay. One of the quotes about the Red Room: carpet was red, crimson cloth. So in the Red Room, Jane is 10 years old, about 10 years old, approaching puberty. And from one point of view, you could argue that the Red Room symbolizes Jane's rite of passage into the mystery of female sexuality, or as Gilbert and Gubar said, rite of passagehood into womanhood. Rite of passage into womanhood. Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman, which basically means it's a book that shows her character development. Use that word in your essay. It's very fancy. The fact that there's an evident use of colour symbolism, i.e. through red, crimson, emphasises how Jane is trapped in her anger. One could argue that the Red Room is also a symbol of the dangers of leaving female passion unchecked, because, it traps Jane. Female passion was seen as quite monstrous in the Victorian era, as you'll later see through Bertha. And the fact that Jane cannot progress throughout society, i.e. she's trapped in a room because she displayed her emotions, because she went absolutely mad and started trying to punch John and everything, just shows how the Victorian ideals were that if you let your emotions control you, you basically can't proceed. Jane's inability to escape her class is also emphasized through how she's completely oppressed by her emotions. If she was John, she would have been just let go. She would have been, everyone else would have been like, oh yeah, he's just exploring his emotions, but because she's female, because she's lower class, because of her double bind of class and gender, Jane's struggling. And you could argue that through this sort of contrast of Jane's oppression versus John's birthright of being violent, of having that sadistic enjoyment of violence and abuse, um, is sort of criticized by Bronte. Yeah. Another quote, like a pale throne. This seems to be orange. I was going to turn it pink, but oh well. Um, so, colour symbolism. Pale, white, rich, daunting male privilege, as shown through the simile comparing the furniture to a throne. Jane feels absolutely diminished under the masculine power, absolutely oppressed by the patriarchal authority that she's under. The use of colour imagery, the use of the adjective pale, it lacks warmth, and it, as you'll see, as I mentioned before, this also acts as a reference to the central binary opposition of fire and ice that frequently recurs throughout the book of Jane Eyre. Jane, in this extract, represents fire, she represents emotion, but she's oppressed under the cold, harsh sort of ice. I'm not sure why I wrote harmless there. The throne also emphasizes Jane's lower class status. She is diminished after all. The throne shows how the Reeds are superior to her because they are of a higher class, not because of their ethical, moral obligations or anything, which Bronte further criticizes throughout Jane Eyre. And I couldn't work out another thing to analyze, so I just did a box there. Thanks. Do another video soon. Subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah, watch this movie if you want. We watched it in school. It's quite funny when you watch it in class. I would recommend. Also, another good movie is called The Dead Poet Society. I would also recommend. Thank you.